left David in an amazing place as he took his role within Israel, taking this leadership role out and with the army and taking Goliath and just becoming this national hero. But there's actually another little place that David also was a hero, a micro hero, a bit of a mini hero, and that's actually in Saul's house. And as we begin to turn our thoughts to Saul's house, we don't first meet David in Saul's house after Goliath. He's actually been there before. And I'd like to begin tonight just by looking at the end of 1 Samuel 16. Now, there's a little bit of a challenge with 1 Samuel 16 because it's kind of hard to place it in the chronological narrative. In the first number of verses in 1 Samuel 16 that we looked at this morning, obviously we have Samuel anointing David to be king. David takes Goliath in chapter 17. Then chapter 17, obviously this is partly David and Goliath and partly some new information. But then you have this, what appears to be something that was a bit out of order. You have David called to help Saul in his house through his just wonderful, amazing gift of music. And then that possibly leads into 1 Samuel 18 as we begin to look at Jonathan. So there is a little bit of a challenge when we read this chronologically. I'm not going to try to solve that, but I would love to chat maybe tonight over a coffee over how you think you can solve this bit of a conundrum here. But I don't want to really focus on that. I'm going to assume that it's actually out of order. And so I want to deal with David in Saul's house now. And this is a great lead up into David's relationship with Jonathan, because remember, of course, Jonathan is in Saul's house. So let's have a look at a few verses at the end of 1 Samuel chapter 16. So 1 Samuel 16, verses 14 through 23. So we have this juxtaposition here of verse 13, where the Spirit of the Lord rushed upon David from that day forward. And some of us talked about that today, which was great. Now, in direct contrast to that, juxtaposed against David, is verse 14 that says, "Now the Spirit of Yahweh had departed from Saul, and a harmful spirit from Yahweh tormented him. And Saul's servants said to him, 'Behold now, a harmful spirit from God is tormenting you. Let our Lord now command your servants who are before you to seek out a man who is skillful in playing the lyre. And when a harmful spirit from God is upon you, he will play it, and you will be well.' So Saul said to his servants, 'Provide for me a man who can play well, and bring him to me.' And one of the young men answered and said, 'Behold, I have seen a son of Jesse, the Bethlehemite, who is skillful in playing, a man of valor, a man of war, prudent in speech, a man of good presence, and the Lord is with him.' So therefore Saul sent messengers to Jesse and said, 'Send me David, your son, who is with the sheep.'" Now, we get some interesting information here about David. King James isn't super helpful here. I'm reading from the ESV, and I hope that helped a little bit. But when you combine the ESV, Holman Christian Standard, and the Net Bible, David is kind of one of those frustratingly talented people. Know anyone like that? That just seems to just have like everything, like the whole complete package. So just think about this for a moment. The guy's skillful in playing the lyre, the harp, the guitar of that day. He's a good musician. It's what he does. He's also a man of valor, a valiant man. He's brave. He's a man of war. He's a warrior. He's a good speaker. He's eloquent. He's articulate. He's a man of good presence. He's handsome. He's good looking. And if that wasn't enough, the Lord is with him. If that wasn't enough, David in this amazing section here is really lifted up for all of his talents. He's got all of this talent. And young people, to whom much is given, much shall be required. David is going to have to exercise all of these talents and harness all of these talents for good. But he is known around town. These are not hidden talents. These are not talents that he buried, wasn't able to use. He had them, but he just hid them because it wasn't something that they did. No, David was open, and he expressed and used the talents that God gave him for God's glory, and so much so that he was known. People in town knew. Edersheim describes it like this. This is a bit of a commentary on what it would have been like in Bethlehem and how Saul, and by extension Jonathan, what they would have known about him, or at least what they would have heard about him. And just thinking about David on those plains of Bethlehem. And to think how in those very plains, the shepherd king may have watched his flock in the quiet of the starlit night and pouring forth accents of praise. Think about that. David is out watching the sheep with his lyre, much the same way that maybe some of you have written songs sitting outside, or if anyone, some people of you guys know the song Creator God. Creator God was literally written sitting outside by a fire, sitting with a guitar, looking at the starry skies, and the Creator God was born. And how many of David's songs were born that way? Sitting out there, thinking about God, pondering about God, thinking about that as he was looking over the sheep. And no doubt, he goes on to say, no doubt this talent of David also, though probably only viewed as a worldly gift, became known in the neighborhood. And so when courtiers of Saul suggested music as the well-known remedy in antiquity for mental disturbances, one of the servant men in attendance, probably a native of the district around Bethlehem, could from personal knowledge recommend David, who was cunning, knowing of speech, and the Lord was with him. So I want to just think about this just for a moment. David is in Saul's house, and Jonathan is watching this happen. Have you ever been with someone looking after one of your parents that was sick? You ever been in that scenario before? When someone that you know comes and actually ministers and supports your parent, or somebody else that you love, it really draws your heart to them. And to me, when I think about Saul, not only here, we're going to see him in another scenario just like this in a few minutes. Fundamentally, when we look at this, we think about Jonathan in that house, thinking, man, I am so glad that somebody like David exists to actually help and support my father in this manner. And this makes a really big impact on Saul, so much so, and again, we're looking for Jonathan here, so much so that he goes on to say in verse 21, David came to Saul, entered his service, and Saul loved him greatly. And he became his armor-bearer. Now that's interesting. He didn't become his in-house musician, but he also technically was. All of his talents being used. He's a man of valor, and he becomes his armor-bearer. But also, goes on to say, Saul sent to Jesse, saying, let David remain in my service, for he has found favor in my sight. And whenever a harmful spirit from God was upon Saul, David took the lyre and played it with his hand. And Saul was refreshed and was well, and the harmful spirit departed from him. Now listen, I don't know what's going on at Suburban, but last time you guys did this, there was no joy. What's going on? You guys, you should be happy with lyres. They bring joy. They're meant to be a joyful instrument. Anyway, I don't know what's going on there at Suburban, but there was many instruments. And when you go back and you look at ancient instruments and their use, what was most powerful about these instruments that was powerful in David's life was that they were portable. They were small. They weren't big organs and pianos. They were portable instruments. They were able to be brought out to campfires. They were able to be brought out to your job. They were able to be in the backseat of your car or your chariot or whatever it is that you had then. There were many beautiful instruments. And if you think about shepherds often can actually play flutes to actually bring their flocks to them. And I have a feeling that David did this. If anybody wants to see a video of this, I can sort of show you what it looked like. When I was in Israel, I actually saw, anybody ever, raise your hand if you ever seen that? A shepherd playing a flute for their sheep? Anyway, give it a try. Anybody got a flute here? There's some sheep right down at the end of the road. You can just give it a try. And to me, David, he employed these instruments for a number of things, for mental health, for stability, for writing music. And when instruments, whatever kind of instrument, whatever it is, if it's used for the glory of God and it's harnessed to make a difference for other people and to bring honor and praise to God, it's something that we should lean into and use. Do not, young people, bury your talents. And I know that there's many of you that are out there and very similar to me. I know you guys play the lyre. It would be great if you continued to do that, because we need more people who are skillful in this way to learn how to play our songs, learn how to play our hymns, so we don't lose these wonderful hymns of our heritage that we have. And David is the great example of that. So much so that later on in his life, David wasn't even okay just with his lyre. He said, that's not good enough. I need more instruments. And the scriptures go on to say that David actually invented instruments. He said, what we use right now is not good enough. It's not just okay to be status quo. We need more. He wasn't even happy with the instruments that were available, so much so that he invented instruments. This is the passion of this man. And it all comes in this early section here where David is ministering to Saul, a very uncanny support of David, and it doesn't become that way later. And what I'm just hoping that you guys will do is just think about music in the ancient world and think about how we can use it. And thank you so much to everybody who sung just before. Continue to do that. The best part about this is that David could take his instrument anywhere. He could take it wherever he wanted, and in every place that was hallowed ground, he was able to pour forth the praises of his God. And one question that I have for y'all is, who taught it? Any ideas? Where did he learn how to play the lyre? Like, he's not just like a casual player, right? I know like Elliot's like a casual lyre player, right? He's good. He really knows how to play. Where did he learn how to play? Well, here's my suggestion. I think God gifted it to him. Some people are just natural at music. It just comes. I think God endowed him to be a warrior poet. He gave this boy the gift of song to be able to bless others, and he exercises it in this chapter. And I think Jonathan saw it. Jonathan was able to see it and appreciate it, and I think it was a huge part of the early observations that Jonathan had about David. Flip over to 1 Samuel chapter 17, and let's just look at the very end of the chapter. So David defeats Goliath. Whatever the chronology is that you put together, here is the lead-in to the real revelation of Jonathan. And it's this. Verse 55 says, as soon as Saul saw David go out against the Philistine, he said to Abner, the commander of the army, Abner, whose son is this youth? And Abner said, as your soul lives, O king, I do not know. And the king said, inquire whose son the boy is. And as soon as David returned from striking down the Philistine, Abner took him and brought him before Saul with the head of the Philistine in his hand. And Saul said, whose son are you, young man? And David said, I am the son of your servant Jesse the Bethlehemite. I've emphasized that, of course, on purpose. What is the strange thing that doesn't get asked here? Who are you? What is your name? Does not get asked. Saul's main concern here is, whose son are you? According to Saul, he was a youth. He's just a youth. Whose son is the youth? I want to know what lineage you're from. I want to know what parentage you have. I want to know all about your lineage. I want to know about your family tree. And all he said was, I am the son of your servant Jesse the Bethlehemite. Now, we found out in chapter 17, I read it in brief earlier this morning, that Jesse was old in chapter 17, He doesn't appear to be someone who was of a very great reputation. And David's brothers, particularly, David's brothers are there trying to become part of his army. But as far as Saul was concerned, nobody had any reputation. And even David feels this way. I am of no reputation. It comes up in chapter 18 and verse 23. David is concerned, since I am a poor man and I have no reputation. Saul is concerned that his word has gone out from him. He said, whoever's going to defeat Goliath is going to be my son-in-law. So Saul's main concern is, what's your family tree? Now, what did we look at this morning? David's family tree is not awesome. And there is a suggestion, and I'll put it up right now. There is a bit of a suggestion here that David, when you look at this section right here, there's a little bit of, let's say it's not just squeaky clean right in this section here. And the logic kind of goes a little bit like this. In 1 Samuel 16 reveals that David was well known to Saul, not of a family of his local connection. Jesse had 8 sons, but regarded as no influence in the community because he was old. Older brothers couldn't speak peaceably to him. They didn't like him. It was kind of like Joseph-esque. I don't know if that's a word, but Joseph-esque. Saul then realizes that David soon is going to become his son, so he wants to know, whose son? Whose son? Not what's your name, whose son are you? And remember, all throughout the rest of this time, when his anger is flared up, what does he refer to David as? The son of Jesse. You can almost see him crunch up his face. The son of Jesse. Where is the son of Jesse? Why hasn't the son of Jesse come today? Saul really doesn't like that he is from Jesse's family. And lastly, which is kind of like the explanation of the previous slide, when you put all of the pieces together, there is a slight possibility that the Ishmaelite forced Abigail, David's sister, via David's unfaithful stepmom, via Nahash. That's kind of how that logic works. You guys will get all these slides, so you can look at them later. The main point is, after this whole thing happens, when you get now to chapter 18, let's read the first 2 verses. As soon as he had finished speaking to Saul, the soul of Jonathan was knit with the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as his own soul. And Saul took him that day, but would not let him return to his father's house. So there is a slight suggestion here that what's going on is that Saul realizes that now I have to have this guy David as part of my family. Jonathan is happy. Jonathan saw him defeat the Philistine. He told his father that he saw it. He loved him. He knew that he was king. He knew that he was deserving of love. And fundamentally, Jonathan was happy. But Saul does not appear to be very happy. And that is going to cause a serious family dynamic challenge for David and Jonathan. And you know, young people, that is true of a lot of friendships. There are many friendships that get struck up under some family conflict. Some people that might not know the background. They might not like where your friends are from. They might not know the family, or they might not like the family that your friends are from. And sometimes these things are really challenging with friendships. Sometimes they have merit. Sometimes they have a small merit. Sometimes your parents bring their own assumptions to the situation. But all David wanted to be seen is as David. It's really difficult when you enter into friendships and relationships and your family baggage is brought. God never did that. God, fortunately, never did that for David. But unfortunately, humans do. And we need to be ready for that and know how to navigate that in life. And so the beginning of David and Jonathan's friendship, although I believe that Jonathan observed all this beautiful talent of David, and he admired David for all of these beautiful things that he was and all these talents that he had, it wasn't going to be easy. And that's what we're going to look at for the rest of class tonight. Now, I want to ask you guys a question here. This is nighttime, so we got to talk a little bit more tonight. Got to keep you guys all awake. I want you guys to tell me, the Menti thing doesn't work because we don't have any internet in here. So I want you to just call it out from the back corner to the front here. What are some qualities that you look for in close friendship? What are some qualities that strike you as the qualities you want in a good friend? Go ahead and call them out. Go ahead. Loyalty. Yep. Yes, okay. Challenge, iron sharpens iron, yep. Honesty, yep. Respect, yeah, you want respect. Compassion, sure. Trust, communication, yep. Keep going. What did you say? Intelligence, I mean, sure. Go ahead. Openness, yes, thank you. Thank you. All right, how about two more? Love. When everyone says love tonight, you have to do this. If anyone says love, you have to do this. That's the sign for love tonight. That's right. And one more. How about on that side? Someone who loves God. Sure. When I think about my best friend and I couldn't really be any different. We have very different backgrounds, different families, different talents, different abilities. And we together burn like one flame. We've been friends ever since high school. And he was in my wedding. And every time I go back to New Jersey to see him, it's like nothing has changed. What makes Todd Lindeblad, for me, so close is that almost every single thing, except for intelligence, that you guys said, no, I'm just kidding. Almost everything that you guys said really characterizes it. And I want you guys to reflect on your own friendships. And I want you to think about what marks those close friends. Now, David, he had like no friends. David was a loner. He didn't have anybody. And what he wanted more than anything was someone that could share everything that you guys said, but most importantly, that last one, someone that could share a close relationship with God. And I believe that this is something that everybody saw, but Jonathan particularly saw. Now, I'm sure you guys appreciated seeing how that video enactment kind of showed how Jonathan was there, and as he's listening to David talk and watching him take this responsibility and listening to what he's saying to Goliath, he's just thinking, I just love that young man. I really need to get to know him. I'd like to just quote something from Harry Tennant. David shot into public life like a meteor rising out of darkness. Evidently, he was comparatively unknown to many, and his ancestry almost certainly unknown to all. Young man, whose son are you? Was the question on everyone's lips. It was a question which Israelites a millennium later might have asked concerning Christ. That's an interesting suggestion, isn't it? Ancestry has played its part throughout the ages in families and nations and between nations. Fame and infamy are attached to family names. It is a good question for us to ask ourselves each day. Whose son or daughter are you? This will help us decide the course to take, the words to use, and the thoughts to think in everyday living. When I think about this, Jonathan was looking at David and just thinking, who is this guy? Where does this come from? And he doesn't know his family name, but Jonathan knew. Unfortunately, what's the answer to Jonathan asking this question? Jonathan, Saul's son, is very often how he gets described, right? Think about it. And Jonathan, Saul's son, arose and went to David in the wood and strengthened his hand in God. Jonathan, Saul's son. My point here, young people, is that your friendships are not defined by the parentages of your friends. Unfortunately, John had a father that was disobedient to the will of God. That didn't make Jonathan unworthy of being a friend. Neither did David's possible questionable lineage. Neither of them cared. And for me, when I think about Todd, his standing with me for our whole life, no matter how messy our families have gotten, no matter how many crazy things have happened within our family, extended family particularly, we've stayed together. We saw each other as an individual. And to me, once David became known in everyday life, everybody fell in love with David, not just Jonathan. Let me show you what I mean. First of all, David literally means beloved. I'm sure some of you are waiting for that to come up. His name means beloved. And some would say he was beloved of the Lord, beloved of his father. But have a look at this. Of course, we already just read that Jonathan loved him as his own soul. His soul was knit with the soul of David. He felt the same as David. And I was hoping that I could just quote from, oops, let me flip over to my note here. I just wanted to quote something that I heard from Liv's dad, one of your Suburbans that I watched this year. Paul Yearsley said this about David. He said, he's on the same page as God. He shared the same values as God. He's got the same passions as God. That's exactly what Jonathan saw in David. I'm just going to replace it now. You can tell your dad I replaced his quote. Jonathan's on the same page as God. He shares the same values as God. He's got the same passions as God. And when those things are true of two friends, it unites them together. You get knit together, and none of the family background matters. None of your culture matters. Those things completely get transcended by a love for God. And that was what marked David and Jonathan's friendship. Now, I think their friendship was deeper than all of these others, but it's worth noting basically everyone loved David. Now Saul's daughter, Michal. Can you do a good guttural k? Michal. It's not Michael. Stop saying that. We have. Where's Josh Elron? Is that right? Where's Josh? Is that right? All right. Got a thumbs up from the native Israel speaker. All right. And also think about this. Saul, when he saw that he had great success, we read it a second ago. He stood in fearful awe of him, but all Israel and Judah loved David and Saul. Behold, the king has delight in you, and all of his servants love you. And then lastly, Saul loved him. And the word for Saul, loved him greatly, means exceedingly much, with might, with force, with overwhelming abundance. So not only did Jonathan love David, Michael loved David, Michal, and all of Saul's servants. And don't forget, at one time, even Saul himself loved David. And that is what makes what you're about to see so tragic.
Sings that praise. He'll look like brother next. David, come here. So, once again, you are our champion. You have killed thousands. Tens of thousands. Of course. Tens of thousands. Our people are very grateful to you. The Lord bless us all. I would like to reward you. I offer you my daughter, Michal. Your Majesty. David, we're brothers now. In return, 100 dead Philistines. What say you? 100 dead Philistines slain by your own hand.
Father, it's risked his life enough, no?
What if he doesn't return?
I shall return. God willing.
Bread and water. Nobody distracted.
Love him like a brother, don't you?
I do.
As Abel no doubt once loved Cain. He wants our crown. Can't you see?
No. He's loyal to us both.
Nonsense.
My lady, he's back. He's back. David's back.
Few mementos for you. And these trophies taken from each of their bodies.
From 100 men?
200. God was with me.
Nichral.
Father, what demons possess you? If it wasn't for him, we would all be slaves, and you would not be king.
And with him, you never will be.
All right. I want you guys, that's basically the next couple of chapters in summary. Tell me, what do you observe? What things do you observe? Yes, jealousy, right? Saul assigned his thousands, David is 10,000s. It's just a dart under Saul. But who was celebrating it? Who was happy for it to be the case? Jonathan. What else? Yes, loyalty. Think about the wedge between Saul and Jonathan, this wedge that gets stuck between them, father and son, because of this beautiful man that's been providentially brought into their life. What else? Yep, the honesty between. Oh, dishonesty. Yep, okay. What else? Yes, Saul started to get paranoid. That's right. Yes, Jonathan having to come to his defense. That's right. We read at the end of our last talk, we read that, right? Him saying, hey, he took his life in his hands. He laid down his life for the sheep, unlike you. See how the tension in the house is beginning to build? What else? Yeah, I'm not. That's an interesting one. I saw a few laughs down here. That's what happened. Saul says, "Bring 100." David brings 200. Bit of a, it's hard to understand. It's really hard to understand that dynamic. There could be a lot in that. There could be not much in that. There could be a lot in that. Anything else? Yes, David has this God consciousness constantly. Jonathan said it. The Lord worked a great salvation. The Lord was with him. The Lord fights my battles. The Lord was with him. Verse 12, because the Lord was with him and had departed from Saul. The Lord was with David, and Saul saw it and knew. Verse 28 says, Saul saw and knew that the Lord was with David. He saw and knew that it was true, and that he knew that the Lord had departed from him. All right, so very challenging dynamic. Unfortunately, irrational behavior arises out of jealousy. Song of Solomon, in a completely different context, of course, says that jealousy is as cruel as the grave. Now, motivated by love between a husband and a wife, that's one thing, but jealousy is like that also. Jealousy can do horrible things. Think about Proverbs 6, verse 34. It says, "For jealousy is the rage of a man, and therefore he will not spare in the day of vengeance." You know, there's some science behind this. When you look at the science behind jealousy, now have a look at this and think about what you just saw and what you knew is contained in this record. According to a study, jealousy in monogamous species causes neurological spikes in the brain, two areas that deal with bonding and social pain. And it features, look at the end here, jealousy is especially interesting given its role in romantic relationships and also in domestic violence. And that's what's going to be manifested over and over here again. Just try to imagine Jonathan standing there and your father going into a jealous rage and throwing a spear at someone that you love so much. Jonathan, Saul's son, delighted much in David because he loved him as his own soul. You see, the two of them had made a covenant. There was a bit of a laugh there about them becoming brothers. Obviously, Jonathan would have loved the idea of David becoming his actual brother-in-law. But it was irrespective of the marriage. That covenant that they made was long before the marriage to Michal in the record. So just think about this challenge. Saul's reaction is mainly to David's success. And we saw the video of verse 6 to 16 of chapter 18. Saul's motivation, it seems, these kinds of things, young people, these can be seen in ecclesial life. Even in ecclesial leadership today, when someone is threatened in their position of authority, all of a sudden, irrational behavior can start to manifest itself in ecclesial life. And it comes out in this particular record in indignation, jealousy, fear, pride, insecurity. And guess what? All of these things, you don't have to be in the battlefield of Israel to see these things. No, some of these things can bite us on the heels in ecclesial life and in youth group life. Let's be careful, young people, that when we have a position in youth group or a position in suburban or in whatever local youth group you have, and someone else begins to come along and have influence and have success in that influence, take heed unto yourself, lest ye fall. It could easily happen to any of us. But what a horrible situation for Jonathan to have to witness his father being like this. I'm sure there's people in this room that, like me, have witnessed irrational behavior by their parents in their own home. Tough, isn't it? Isn't it tough when you watch your parents behave irrationally, unchristlike, maybe flying off the handle? It's very difficult, and it has a lasting emotional impact on us. Obviously, there's some parents in the room. I'm a parent now. I have to think about this. The impact that it has, and the impact of Saul's behavior on his relationship with Jonathan was super, super challenging. Just thinking a little bit more about that. David becomes basically like a red sheet to a bull with Saul. Every time David comes up, Saul just loses the plot. And this is mainly because of this one fact. Saul rejected the word of the Lord and sinned, and David hid it in his heart that he might not sin. David was in fellowship with God, and Saul was not. And he wished that he was. At one point, he knew what that was like. Harry Whitaker says this: Saul's jealousy for his own personal reputation, which was later to poison his good relations with both Jonathan and David, was already becoming a marked feature of his character. Did I do something wrong here? No, I'm just going to keep going. All right, Uncle Brian. Uncle Brian once said it like this, and I thought this was so amazing. Uncle Brian said, the divine preparation was being made as David watched the sheep and God was in the watchtower. David's crown was being made whilst he was in the hills around Bethlehem, and Saul's was lost while he still wore it. Very, very, very sad. So let's focus a little bit more on Jonathan. So we focused a lot on David, and we look at Jonathan looking at David. Let's not forget the character profile of Jonathan, because remember, the two of them make a covenant together. It's not just Jonathan that loves David. David also loves Jonathan. You remember 1 Samuel 13, when the Philistines controlled the town, they passed at Michmash. Israel was weaponless, ruthlessly oppressed by the Philistines. Jonathan and Saul were literally the only two people who had swords under the iron grip of the Philistines, who took all of their weapons. Jonathan and his armor-bearer, they don't tell Saul. The people don't know. It's just the two of them, and they go up, and yet Saul's got 3,000 men. There was no faith in Israel under Saul. But for Jonathan, he had the faith to, one, he looked to providence. He looked for God's guidance and looked for a sign for God's intervention. And fundamentally, Jonathan's faith triumphs over danger. He looks for a sign from God. It's an earthquake in this particular case. And in the Septuagint version, I thought this is quite interesting. If this happens to be the case, look at this little link to David. In the Septuagint version, it also adds with darts and slings and pebbles of the field. Kind of makes sense. Saul's tribe was the tribe of Benjamin, who couldn't miss a shot with their slingshot. Maybe even in the way that they battled, maybe even in the way that they went to war, there was similarities between David and Jonathan. Now, as much as they were similar, they were also quite different. Think about this, and again, when I think about Todd and I think about your friends, think about a contrast. Jonathan is from Benjamin, David is from Judah. Jonathan's from a prominent family. David's from a nobody family. Jonathan is quite a bit older than David. He's between 35 and 40. David is like 20 years old or less. Jonathan is the eldest son of a king. David is the eighth son, the last son of Jesse. Jonathan is the crown prince. David is a lowly shepherd. Jonathan is rich. David is poor. Jonathan was served by many. David was a servant. Jonathan was a commander in an army at the time. David was too young for an army. Jonathan had the best weapons, some of the only weapons in Israel, and David had nothing, no sword, no bow, just a sling and a staff. That's it. So they were very different, but yet the same. But it's not the outside that was the same. It's the same thing for me and my best friend, and maybe that's for some of the friendships that you're forging here. Look at this, the very similar scenario when you outline these two things together. Their view of going up against the battle was very similar. There's a lot of comparisons that you can make, not only in their language, but in the scenario that happened. Fundamentally, it was the Lord's deliverance that made it the same. And the last person's suggestion, the thing that makes all the difference in your friendships is that God consciousness. And fundamentally, that is what drew Jonathan to David and David to Jonathan. Harry Tennant put it this way, and I think this is so beautiful, and you saw it in the video that we looked at when David was going up against Goliath. David's conversation with Saul after the rout of the Philistines was heard, no doubt by several of the royal entourage, courtiers, stewards, military men, attendants, and the like. But one of the hearers discovered that David was speaking the thoughts of his own heart. Jonathan and David were truly kindred spirits, and when the moment came, they conversed eagerly, understandingly, and unreservedly. So when we look at the rest of that section in 1 Samuel 18, in the first 5 verses, verse 3 is very important. Jonathan made a covenant with David, and because he loved him as his own soul. But look at what he does to demonstrate this. Look at what he does to illustrate this kind of love to him. He makes himself vulnerable. We don't have to read that. That was just talking about the age difference between them. But there are these covenants. They make 3 covenants. Here is the first one that gets made in verse 3. They make another one in chapter 20, and they make another one the last time they meet in chapter 23. But something wonderful happens here in the next verse. Verse 4, and Jonathan stripped himself of the robe that was on him and gave it to David and his armor and even his sword, even his bow and his belt. Just think about what Jonathan was doing there. Jonathan is making himself completely vulnerable. He's getting rid of all of his protection, everything that he was guarding, everything that was keeping him safe, and he removes all of it and gives it to David. He completely empties himself for David. And I want you to just think about that, young people. Think about what it takes. What cost are you willing to pay to get close friendships? You know, you don't get close to friends by being insular. You don't build close friendships by hiding. You get close friendships by being open and honest and vulnerable and accessible. And Jonathan does this most beautiful thing. Obviously, one of the things he was doing here was what? Showing David that he believed he was the next king. And very sadly, that was going to be a real challenge. Think about what this ends up looking like a little bit later between Saul and Jonathan. Saul can't stand the fact that Jonathan has done this, and it's openly known that Jonathan has voted in David's direction. And look at what Saul ends up doing. Again, this is that family violence, the violence in the home. In this case, it's verbal. He even goes after Jonathan's mom. He says, "You son of a perverse, rebellious woman, do I not know that you have chosen the son of Jesse to your own shame and to the shame of your mother's nakedness? For as long as the son of Jesse lives on the earth, neither you nor your kingdom shall be established. Therefore send and bring him to me, and he shall die." All Saul was concerned about was Jonathan becoming king. And the most beautiful thing about Jonathan was he didn't have to be king. He didn't want to be king. So long as David was around, he didn't care. But think about how much that would have hurt Jonathan. Listening to your father say something like that about your best friend. These guys became best friends very quickly. And look what it says. He was grieved for David. Why? Because his father had disgraced him. His father had disgraced him. So I'd like to just finish by looking at a few more verses just to look at that relationship with David and Jonathan. And I'm hoping that we can make an example. Guys, you're here at Hebron to find friends like this. This is the place that you guys are going to find friendships that run this deep. So let's look, as we look at David and Jonathan as we close here, let's think about what these verses say about their relationship. And I want you guys to think about finding maybe just one, maybe two. It doesn't have to be 100, right? Someone that has many companions will come to ruin, but there is a friend that sticks closer than a brother. Look at the God consciousness between these two. Highlighting a few things. Look at everything in yellow. Look at the God consciousness between these two. The Lord do so to Jonathan, and more also, if I do not disclose to you and send you away that you may go in safety. May the Lord be with you as he has been with my father. What an amazing statement. And he says, if I am still alive, please show me the steadfast love of the Lord that I might not die, and do not cut off the steadfast love for my house forever. When the Lord cuts off, look at this knowledge. When the Lord cuts off every one of the enemies of David from the face of the earth. And Jonathan made a covenant, not only with David, but with his whole house. He made a covenant with the house of David, saying, may the Lord take vengeance on David's enemies. And Jonathan made David swear by his love for him, for he loved him as his own soul. And as for the matter of which you and I have spoken, the Lord is between me and you forever. These are forever friendships. And when you build friendships on this kind of love, by the love that they have for each other, these are friendships that last forever. I think that's just quite beautiful. They loved each other as their own soul. Second one, they meet again. David rose from up behind his seat and fell on his face to the ground and bowed. Look at the reverence. Look at the respect that he has. bowed 3 times, and they kissed one another. This is a very Italian thing to do, by the way. It's not going to happen this weekend, but I'm just saying, this is a very Italian expression. It's very Mediterranean. Think about the New Testament, greet one another with a holy kiss. They were willing to be close enough that they could kiss one another. And they did kiss one another, and they wept together, David weeping the most. And Jonathan said to David, "Go in peace, for we have sworn both of us in the name of the Lord, saying, the Lord be between me and you forever, and between my offspring and your offspring forever." And he rose and departed, and Jonathan went in the city, and that was it. And here's the last one. Look at how Jonathan was able to humble himself for God's will and God's purpose with David. Jonathan, Saul's son, rose and went to David in Horesh, or the wood, and strengthened his hand in God. That was the very object of their friendship. He strengthened his hand in God, and he said to him, "Do not fear, for the hand of Saul my father shall not find you." Look at that faith that he has, that David will be what God anointed him to be. And he says, "You shall be king over Israel." And here's where Jonathan was happy to be. "And I shall be next unto you. And even Saul, my father, knows this." And the 2 of them made a covenant before the Lord, remained in Horesh, and Jonathan went home. Kind of reminds you of John the Baptist. So, young people, I hope that as we've looked tonight at these 2, we can see exactly what Jesus said when this kind of friendship happens. What Jesus has called us friends. And when we have a friendship that's mutual with our Lord Jesus Christ, beautiful fruit comes. And there's so much fruit of obedience and service and love that came out of the relationship between David and Jonathan. And I hope that we can just, as much as possible, look for friends like that